Hello everyone. I'm very sorry we weren't able to have our session last week, and as requested I am uploading this presentation on autonomy, collaboration, and motivation in language learning. I actually want to start with a couple of questions, which is, despite the fact that we know that these elements are very, very important in learning in general, especially in language learning, I would want to pose the question regarding whether they are necessary, and if so, are they really possible, taking into account our context. First thing I would like to ask is regarding Camille's postulate in her article. Do we think autonomy really is the aim of education? Because obviously if it is, it has certain very, very far-reaching implications on our practice. So let's review some of these concepts and what some theorists say about them. In the first place, what is autonomy? Camille, from Piaget's point of view, says that autonomy means being governed by oneself. It is the opposite of heteronomy, which means being governed by someone else. I would start off here with another question, which is, can one really govern oneself? When we live in a society where we must interact with other people, is it possible to govern yourself? It's a difficult question, I think, to answer. However, we should take into account that, according to Piaget, the child acquires knowledge as well as moral values by construction from within, as Camille states in her article. So this is important because we tend to consider that autonomy is very related to morality. And yet what Piaget and Camille are going to say is that this is not true. That, of course, there is moral autonomy, and it's that capacity of making decisions, let's say from a more philosophical point of view regarding who you are as a person, as a citizen, as an individual, but that it's very, very closely related to intellectual autonomy, which is deciding how you learn, what you want to do with what you learn, and these two are practically inseparable. And therefore, this point of view greatly affects what we do in teaching. As Camille goes on to say, whatever subject matter we teach, be it natural science, history, geography, etc., languages in our case, we teach it differently when our long-term goal is to foster the development of autonomy in students. And of course, it's not then just a matter of teaching language skills as such, but it's a matter of addressing how we can help students become more autonomous learners, more autonomous individuals. And then we come to the question of autonomy and independence. Are they the same thing? I think that they're often used interchangeably, but I'm not sure that they are actually the same thing. Benson and Bowler state that in spite of widespread agreement on the importance of autonomy and independence, there remains a good deal of uncertainty about their meanings and implications for language education. So, are they the same thing? Do they refer to governing oneself versus being separate from others? Can we be separate from others? Is autonomy this possibility of doing things on our own? Because sometimes that's what independence seems to mean, right? When we say, for example, that a young child is becoming more independent because he or she can tie his or her own shoes, for example, are we saying that he or she is more autonomous? And on the other hand, does being autonomous mean that we don't need other people? And that's a really important question, because I would say probably not. Is it self-instruction or learner control? Very often when we think of especially self-access materials, it becomes a question of students learning on their own, without help from others, and I don't think this is possible. It's one thing to have some degree of control over your learning, and quite another to teach yourself, to be sort of autodidactic, that you instruct yourself, there's the material, this is what you need to learn, go ahead and learn it. Because I don't think that's possible. Obviously, some people do learn on their own without help from others, but that requires some very important personality traits in order to be able to do so. And it seems quite difficult when actually you have resources that you could use to learn better. Is it an individual characteristic or a characteristic of social groups? Am I the autonomous person, or does society promote in social groups the possibility of being autonomous and making collective and making collective decisions and seeking the well-being of all, reaching consensuses and that kind of dynamic? And finally, are we talking about this being a capacity or a right? Do I become more capable and more autonomous, or do I have the right to be so? Because one might imply that either I have it or I don't. That capacity to govern myself or to make decisions on my own. Or do I have a right to do that, and therefore should teachers, schools, school systems, governments actively work towards effective ways of helping people to become more and more autonomous as individuals and obviously as learners? Aside from this comparison of these two terms, autonomy and independence, there are also a lot of associated terms. I've chosen a few of them to talk about, and it's not so much about seeing what the definitions of these terms are as such, but of determining what they actually mean in my practice. What significance do they have for me in what I do, in how I teach, and ultimately how do they affect my students? There's the idea of self-direction. I've chosen Dickinson's definition, which is the responsibility for one's own learning. It is defined as a student and environment characteristic where there is greater control and initiative of the student. There's also a self-regulation, which according to Murray is the active participation in one's own learning process, and it's more of a student characteristic of being able to regulate how I approach learning. Self-access, of course, tends to refer to resources, especially technological, for individual language learning. And it has a lot to do with the idea of independent learning, right? That I can access these materials on my own, in my own time, and often without interaction with a teacher or with peers. Individualization, according to the U.S. Department of Education, is teaching adapted to student rhythms and needs. And of course, here we have a huge constraint, which is that we have so many students in our classrooms, and having individualized instruction becomes very, very complex. Although, of course, it can be promoted with the use of self-access materials. However, what we do know is if we don't address student rhythms and needs, our instruction may not be as effective as we would like it to be, and ultimately we have the results that we have according to the Ministry of Education. And finally, I want to talk about differentiation, which according to the Department of Education is teaching adapted to student preferences. That is the way students not like to learn, not necessarily as an individualization where it's how they need to learn, but how they prefer to engage in the learning process in order to achieve the same results, but perhaps in different manners or through different paths. Noonan has proposed a way of promoting autonomy with certain steps or strategies that we should put into place, such as making instruction goals clear to learners, allowing learners to create their own goals, and this is something that I think rarely happens in education, to encourage learners to use their second language outside the classroom. This is a very interesting strategy because we know that we have few hours of class in school, we have few resources, and we have many students. Therefore, the exposure that a single student may have to the second language is very, very low. And we know through research that exposure is necessary for language learning. The more you are exposed to the language, the more you will probably learn it. That's the whole idea of an immersion process, right? So this idea of having students have resources, strategies, and being pushed a little into using it outside of the classroom may actually have very, very interesting results, both on their autonomy, because they do have to do it on their own and make some decisions and maybe talk to a friend, look for a resource on the internet, or even ask you perhaps via email. But also, when faced by the language, when you don't have as much support, then you really realize what you understood and perhaps what questions you have for the next class. This is very tied to raising the awareness of the learning process. Students aren't very aware of how they learn, and of course, they have no idea about their own preferred styles and strategies. So if we really want students to be autonomous and to be able to learn on their own without having the constant support of the teacher, we have to make sure that they're aware of their learning processes, styles, and strategies. Encourage learner choice, and again, this is something I feel does not happen in the language classroom, or in any classroom for that matter, because most programs are predetermined. Teachers spend a lot of time planning and organizing everything, and everybody does everything at the same rate and the same order. So choice is very, very limited. And to say nothing of allowing learners to generate their own tasks, or encouraging them to become teachers and researchers. We know very well then that when we teach something, we also learn it. So when learners become teachers, this also helps them to learn better. They help their peers. They develop a sense of the importance of serving and helping others. And at the same time, they're learning. So it seems to be a win-win situation all around. There are some barriers and obviously some advantages. Among the barriers are that the methods and approaches in and of themselves don't necessarily promote autonomy. For example, we think technology or learner-centered approaches or individualization automatically promote autonomy. And this isn't always true. If there is no intention of developing autonomy and scaffolding and making the learner aware of this, they actually may become more dependent, as we'll see further on, of precisely those elements that are meant to promote autonomy. Then they can't do it if the technology isn't in place. If they aren't using specific strategies, something changes and they need to change the strategy, then they don't know what to do. Policies and cultural factors affect the development of autonomy, especially in a culture as heteronomous as our own. Sometimes parents and students will have comments such as, wait a minute, why does my son or daughter have to do this on his or her own? You're the teacher, you're being paid to teach, please go ahead and teach him, right? And so it becomes very difficult when the whole system doesn't promote autonomy. Benson and Voller actually have the question of whether it is possible to teach learners how to be autonomous without at the same time denying their autonomy. It seems sort of like a contradiction. So we would have to do this balancing act that allows us to help students become autonomous without vulnerating that same autonomy. There are, of course, many changing roles for teachers and students. Are we prepared for those? Will students be willing to take on the responsibility of their own learning processes, supported by the teacher, of course, because it's so much easier to say, oh, I wasn't taught that. The teacher didn't tell me to do that. They make really, really great excuses. I'm going to pause here so that the video does not become so heavy, and I will continue in the next one with the advantages of promoting autonomy.